was the golden-haired sweetheart of her hometown.
Miss Popularity, very smart, very fun.
Paul Bernardo was every woman's fantasy.
You look at it and you figure this guy's got everything going for him. He's got the world by the tail.
When this gorgeous couple got together, they could barely keep their hands off each other.
There is this incredible sexual attraction.
But behind the couple's perfect exterior lay a hidden darkness.
Tied up, sexually assaulted, dumped in a ditch.
It would soon lead police to uncover a series of gruesome discoveries.
Young women were being attacked and sexually assaulted.
You could hear the girls whimpering, crying.
And when the awful truth was finally unraveled, it would lay bare a series of crimes so sadistic and terrifying, it would make headlines around the world.
There's so many twisted layers to the story. There is horror. There is outrage.
Who would ever imagine that this seemingly perfect Ken and Barbie couple could have such evil minds?
June 29th, 1991. Lake Gibson, Ontario. It was a peaceful afternoon at this picturesque reservoir just outside of Toronto. A local fisherman was walking along the water's edge when he spotted something strange.
The reservoir level fell and they exposed these blocks.
The blocks appeared to be made out of concrete, and when the fisherman bent toward the closest block to inspect it, he saw something that horrified him.
He sees body parts encased in cement.
The fisherman immediately called 911. When officers arrived, they found that all 8 cement blocks contained human body parts. Body parts that appeared to belong to the same victim.
Someone's not just killed someone, they've gone to the extra step of trying to bury their body parts and keep them concealed with the closed cement.
But who was this victim, and who had killed them? As police worked to answer those questions, they would ultimately uncover a terrifying tale and expose a pair of killers whose crimes were so horrifying, bizarre, and unspeakable, it would capture the world's attention. With its tree-lined streets and picturesque neighborhoods, the Toronto suburb of St. Catharines, Ontario, seems like the perfect place to raise a family. And for 17-year-old Carla Homolka, growing up in St. Catharines was nothing short of ideal. Born in 1970, Carla Homolka was the oldest of 3 beautiful and outgoing daughters. But Carla stood out even among her beautiful sisters.
Miss Popularity, very smart, and apparently very fun. Carla had everything going for her.
She was particularly close to her youngest sister, Tammy, who wanted to be just like Carla.
Tammy Homolka, a sweet, vivacious, outgoing girl, looked up very much to her older sister.
But even though the teenage Carla had the admiration of both her sister and her peers, she longed for more than her mundane suburban life. She often talked of one day moving to the big city.
She had those kind of dreams, a small town girl gonna move to the big city and do really well in her life.
Eager to get a jump start on a career she hoped could make her big city dreams come true, Carla began working at an animal clinic when she was still in high school and set her sights on becoming a veterinarian.
Carla Homolka loved animals.
She was volunteering at a veterinary clinic.
And when she was 17, Carla's work gave her an opportunity for a taste of the big city life she craved.
Carla came to Toronto for a veterinarian's convention.
She and a girlfriend are sent and they stay at a Howard Johnson.
Carla was thrilled to finally be in Toronto. But before she and her girlfriend hit the town, they decided to stop by the hotel's restaurant to get a quick bite to eat. And it was there where Carla Homolka met the man who would ultimately change her life in ways she'd never imagined.
At that time, Paul Bernardo and a friend of his
came into the restaurant.
That's where they first laid eyes on each other, and it was, to all intent and purpose, love at first sight.
Born in 1964, Paul Bernardo was raised in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough. And just like Carla, Paul also stood out as a child.
He was considered a charming child, cute, blonde.
But unlike the Homolka household, the Bernardo home was anything but fun.
From the outside, it looked like a pretty suburban home, but on the inside, it was a fractured, dysfunctional family, loud, lots of arguments.
Paul Bernardo's mother and father stayed in separate bedrooms. There was issues in the family. I think it weighed heavily on Bernardo as he was growing up.
Paul handled the turmoil at home by focusing on his future. Like Carla, he had big dreams of fortune and success. And Paul was determined to make those dreams come true. After majoring in accounting in college, Paul landed a coveted job at a top Toronto accounting firm.
You look at it and you figure this guy's got everything going for him. He's got the world by the tail.
Add in his boyish good looks and charm, and the 23-year-old was easily the most eligible bachelor in the office.
He was, as they say, girl crazy, and the girls were attracted to him.
Including 17-year-old Carla Homolka. Paul immediately caught her eye when he walked into the hotel restaurant on the first night she was in Toronto.
Everything she'd ever dreamed of just walked in the door.
The attraction was mutual. Paul was instantly obsessed with the blonde teenager's bombshell good looks. In fact, the chemistry between the two was so immediate and intense that within just a few hours of meeting, Carla decided to ditch her friend and take Paul back to her hotel room.
They went upstairs and they had ferocious, primal sex.
But this was no one-night stand. Even after Carla returned to St. Catharines, Paul continued to pursue her, and once he met the Homolkas, Paul was equally as taken by them.
He loved the Homolka family. He loved the warmth. He didn't have that at home.
Even though Carla was technically underage, the Homolkas didn't seem to mind her dating a 23-year-old. Paul had a good job and was extremely charming. In fact, it didn't take long before he'd won over the entire family.
He brought presents for the family, and he became part of the family, sort of the perfect boyfriend for their perfect Carla.
Carla's sister Tammy was especially wowed by her older sister's new boyfriend.
She just sort of looked up to him as perhaps an older brother, and there was a little bond between them.
Soon, Paul was spending every weekend at the Homolka home, traveling back to Toronto during the week for his job. And whenever Paul was in town, he and Carla made the most of their time together in Carla's isolated basement bedroom.
There was this incredible sexual attraction. She had an aggressive side. She was willing to take sexual risks.
Which meant when Paul suggested that they start videotaping their sexual escapades, Carla was all for it.
Almost from the moment Paul and Carla met, he wanted to record her. She wasn't shy of the camera, and she loves looking at herself. And the video camera became the third playmate in that relationship.
Eventually, Paul was spending so much time at the Homolka house that he moved in. And on Christmas Eve of 1989, after 2 years of dating, Paul surprised the entire family when he proposed to his now 19-year-old girlfriend. Carla was quick to accept.
They were definitely a kind of Barbie couple, and to look at them, you've probably thought, this is quite the couple. They're going to do quite well.
Carla and Paul immediately began planning an elaborate wedding. But the following Christmas, just 6 months before Carla and Paul were scheduled to tie the knot, tragedy struck the Homolka family. On December 23rd, the Homolkas hosted a Christmas party. But when Paul and Carla went downstairs for bed, they discovered Carla's teenage sister, Tammy, lying unconscious.
She's not responsive. She's not breathing.
Paul and Carla immediately called 911, but it was too late.
Police arrived, but they were unable to revive her.
Paramedics determined that Tammy had been drinking during the Christmas party. She must have gotten drunk, gone downstairs where she passed out and began vomiting.
If you vomit and you have food in your stomach, you're liable to then aspirate. You will probably die.
Police ruled it an accidental death.
Carla and her family were devastated. In the wake of Tammy's tragic passing, Paul and Carla decided it was time for a change. In February, they moved out of the Homolka home and into a renovated cottage in nearby Port Dalhousie. Once there, Carla threw herself into finalizing the plans for their summer wedding. And on June 29, 1991, the Homolka family set aside their grief long enough to watch as Carla and Paul tied the knot.
We had the wedding that most people dream of having, beautiful weather, horse-drawn carriage. It was something out of a Hollywood movie.
But the wedding wouldn't be the only thing to happen that day that would appear to be ripped straight out of Hollywood. That same afternoon, just a few miles down the road in Lake Gibson, a gruesome discovery was being made that was as sick and twisted as anything out of a horror movie. A discovery that would ultimately jeopardize what seemed like Carla and Paul's bright future, while at the same time exposing their darkest secrets.
There's so many twisted layers to the story.
Or it was once a sick fantasy becomes a reality.
Coming up, investigators uncover more disturbing details about the dismembered victim in the lake.
There was torture. There was forced drug and alcohol ingestion.
But the investigation takes a shocking turn when the case becomes connected to another terrifying crime.
There is horror. There is outrage.
From the moment they first laid eyes on one another, Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo fell madly in love. The couple had just made that love official on June 29, 1991, in a lavish, over-the-top wedding celebration.
They were this seemingly perfect Ken and Barbie couple.
But on that same day, the happy news of the Bernardo wedding was being overshadowed by word of a dark and disturbing discovery on a secluded lakeshore just a few miles away.
The body parts, encased in cement, began to be pulled out of Lake Gibson.
Police officers ultimately uncovered 8 cement blocks containing body parts. When put together, the body parts seemed to belong to a single victim. But detectives found no clues to the victim's identity or the killer's. But while investigators didn't have much in the way of evidence, they did have a hunch as to who their murder victim might be. Leslie Mahaffey was a local girl who'd mysteriously gone missing 2 weeks earlier.
Everybody knew Leslie Mahaffey had gone missing. That was the only missing girl.
She essentially vanished into thin air and was never seen again.
Leslie had disappeared after being last seen near her parents' house on the evening of June 14, 1991. Police had initially suspected that Leslie was a runaway, given that her parents admitted they'd recently been fighting with their teenage daughter.
They thought that maybe Leslie had run away, or she was too afraid to come home, or she was too mad to come home.
But that was 2 weeks ago, and given that no one had seen or heard from Leslie since, detectives now feared something far more sinister might have happened to the teen. Detectives obtained Leslie's dental records, and it wasn't long before their fears were confirmed.
The police were able to link the body parts to Leslie Mahaffey.
It was a heartbreaking discovery, but Leslie's identity wasn't the only thing the medical examiner was able to uncover. While her limbs and head had been severed, Leslie's torso had been kept largely intact, and based on the injuries sustained to her body, the medical examiner was able to determine that she endured an excruciating level of pain and sexual abuse before her death.
There was torture. There was raping, violent raping.
That's something that's beyond your normal realm.
Investigators immediately began looking into anyone in the area who might be considered capable of committing such a horrific crime.
They looked at criminals who had a similar history with assaults on young girls.
But detectives were unable to connect anyone to Leslie's kidnapping or turn up any solid leads.
None of them came up with anything concrete. There was never an arrest or anything like that.
Knowing that Leslie's killer was still at large was a troubling thought for both police officers and parents in the community. But those fears reached fever pitch when 9 months later, another young girl suddenly went missing. On April 16, 1992, Kristen French disappeared on her usual walk home from school.
When Kristen doesn't show up at the same time that she always shows up, it just didn't make sense. And her parents became alarmed.
Police began looking for the missing teen by retracing her last known route. And in searching a church parking lot Kristen was known to walk through on her way home from school, detectives made a disturbing discovery.
They find Kristen French's shoe in the church parking lot.
For police, it was a clue with ominous implications.
That implies that she was taken against her will.
Investigators immediately launched an intensive search. Meanwhile, news of Kristen's abduction spread through the community like wildfire, as did rumors that the teenager might have possibly fallen into the same sinister hands that kidnapped, tortured, and killed Leslie Mahaffey.
You have a body turning up in the reservoir. Now you have a young girl being kidnapped.
They're starting to think that maybe there's a connection.
A connection that, if true, meant the race was on to find Kristen and her kidnapper before he could take her life, too. Coming up, a startling confession details a horrific crime.
What kind of malignant person could have done such a horrible thing?
And cutting-edge new technology gives police their first break in the case and exposes shocking ties back to St. Catherine's perfect newlywed couple.
Who would ever imagine that this seemingly perfect couple could have such evil minds?
In April of 1992, Paul and Carla Bernardo were living out their first year of newlywed bliss in the small town of Port Dalhousie, Ontario.
They were a young couple making their way very happily through the early stages of their married life.
But just a few miles away in Carla's hometown of St. Catharines, times were anything but happy. 9 months earlier, the dismembered body of teenager Leslie Mahaffey had been found encased in cement along the shoreline of a local reservoir. And just recently, another teenage girl named Kristen French had mysteriously vanished while walking home from school. A disappearance that had locals and police fearing that a serial killer might be hunting the teenage girls of their small town.
You have a body turning up in a lake, and now you have a young girl being kidnapped, and I think people were in shock. They looked at it as possibly connected.
Despite a massive search initiative, police could turn up no trace of Kristen, nor could they ID any potential suspects who might be responsible for the crimes. Finally, 14 days later, on April 30th, 1992, detectives received a phone call that a local motorist had finally found Kristen French, but not the way anyone had hoped.
They found her body dumped in a ditch just on the outskirts of town.
She was strangled. Her body was deposited at the side of a road.
An examination of Kristen's body showed that just like Leslie Mahaffey, she too had endured unspeakable horrors leading up to her death.
She was tied up, sexually assaulted. Kristen French died of strangulation.
And even though Kristen's body hadn't been dismembered like Leslie's, cops were growing more confident the same killer was behind both gruesome slayings. But it was clear whoever the murderer was, they'd also gone to great lengths to conceal their identity.
Her body is washed and scrubbed, and so there's no trace evidence.
With so little to go on, investigators in St. Catharines were left with not much more than the uneasy knowledge that their small town was being stalked by a monster.
Police didn't seem to have any solid leads.
Police haven't got a clue as to what's going on.
The case quickly went cold and stayed that way for the next 6 months. Then, in January of 1993, police received an unexpected lead in the form of a phone call from Toronto detectives who were on the hunt for their own sexual predator.
The Toronto police were looking for what they termed the Scarborough rapist.
According to Toronto investigators, the Scarborough Rapist was the nickname of an unknown assailant believed to be responsible for the rapes of at least 11 women in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough.
He would get women walking home late at night or getting off the bus. It was unstoppable, I guess you could say. They just couldn't have him.
So far, police had been unable to identify a suspect. But with the help of his victims, police had been able to produce a sketch composite of what the Scarborough Rapist supposedly looked like.
He was a blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy, muscular, about 6 feet tall, between 180 and 200 pounds.
Almost like a Hollywood movie star. White guy with fairly good looks. Not the kind of stereotypical person you'd think.
Once the sketch was released to the public, Toronto police found themselves overwhelmed by calls from tipsters who claimed to recognize the man in the picture.
Hundreds of people who matched that description, and we got all their DNA samples.
But at the time, DNA was a new technology, and working through the samples from over 100 suspects took years. In December of 1992, detectives were 5 years into the investigation. By that time, the rapes had stopped, but investigators hadn't. They had finally worked their way through all of the samples, and in the end, all had been successfully eliminated as a potential match. Every suspect, except one. And according to Toronto investigators, the one DNA sample that had just come back as inconclusive in tests belonged to Port Dalhousie resident Paul Bernardo. The sample had been taken 2 years ago during the height of the rape investigation, when a friend of Paul's had tipped off Toronto police that Paul bore an uncanny resemblance to the sketch of the Scarborough Rapist.
He told the police that they should look at his friend who had similar features.
But when police had brought Paul in to give a DNA sample, they'd quickly dismissed him as a suspect.
He wanted to be helpful to police, provided information and samples that the police asked for.
He didn't come across as someone who was trying to hide stuff.
But now, 2 years later, Paul's DNA test results had finally come back as inconclusive, and Toronto investigators were very eager to find out what police in St. Catharines knew about Paul Bernardo. St. Catharines detectives checked their files, and it turned out they did have an open investigation on Paul. Just days earlier, Paul's wife had filed charges against him for spousal abuse.
Carla Homolka says she was beaten by Paul and he used a flashlight. And he'd beaten her very badly. And she'd called police.
He whacked her in the face and left her with 2 very noticeable black eyes.
Based on the violent nature of the attack, investigators began to wonder if Paul Bernardo was violent with his wife, was it possible he'd been violent with other women as well? Instead of asking Paul that question directly, investigators decided to start by speaking with his wife.
They go to the wife, thinking that she might now be an ally to give them the scoop on who they're dealing with.
But Carla had already moved out of the Port Dalhousie home, and investigators had a tough time tracking her down. That is, until they got a phone call from her attorney. He explained that Carla did have information about the rapes in Scarborough, but that wasn't all the information she had.
Carla has first-hand knowledge of the abductions and sexual tortures and ultimately the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French.
Carla's attorney explained that his client was only willing to talk if she could protect herself as well. Realizing this might be their only chance to catch their serial killer, St. Catharines police worked quickly with prosecutors to hammer out a deal.
Carla would come in as on a queen for a day agreement, which means that nothing she says could be used against her later, but yet tell the truth.
Accompanied by her attorney, Carla sat down with prosecutors and investigators in February of 1993. She began by telling them that while she and Paul may have looked like they were living a fairy tale, in reality, her life was a nightmare.
He's very controlling, manipulative, dominates her time.
He started getting more aggressive with her, and he started hitting her.
According to Carla, even their sex life had taken a violent turn.
He wanted rough sex, and he wanted domination.
So when Toronto police originally questioned Paul about the rapes in Scarborough, Carla wasn't surprised when Paul had come home from the station and told her they were right.
He confessed to her that he'd raped some 15, 18 women at the time.
As time passed, Paul realized he wasn't going to be arrested, and Carla told investigators that the experience left him emboldened and ready to act on his darkest fantasy.
He thinks he's so far in the clear, he's ready to escalate his sexual violence.
Eventually, he wanted women that he could keep in his custody.
Carla told investigators that just 2 weeks before their wedding, Paul showed up at their house with a terrified Leslie Mahaffey.
He brought Leslie into the house. Carla was sleeping at the time, and she woke up, and what's this?
Paul told Carla he had come upon Leslie in her own yard.
They started to talk, and eventually got her into the car, and that's when he kidnapped her.
Carla told police that over the next 24 hours, Paul drugged and repeatedly raped the teenager.
She is drugged, she is sexually assaulted repeatedly.
And once Paul was finished with her, he told Carla that he wouldn't let Leslie walk away to give a description of him, as his other rape victims had.
She cannot live. She must be killed.
According to Carla, Paul strangled Leslie, and then came up with a gruesome plan.
He dismembered her body in the basement, put the pieces in concrete, and threw it into a reservoir.
Carla told investigators that after Leslie's death, she hoped that Paul's appetite for sexual violence had been satiated. But 9 months later, she found out that wasn't the case. Paul was ready to bring home another sex slave, only this time he insisted on Carla's help. Carla had no choice but to go along with him.
She said she is complicit only because she was beaten and had no control.
She told police that on the afternoon of April 16th, 1992, she and Paul drove around St. Catharines looking for a victim. Paul zeroed in on Kristen French as she walked through the church parking lot.
Carla got out of the car, and she was looking for directions and asking Kristen if she could help.
Not sensing any danger, Kristen agreed to help. But as soon as she got close to the car, she was ambushed by Paul.
And the next thing she knew, she's being pushed into the car and kidnapped.
Back at the newlyweds' cottage, Kristen faced a similar fate as Leslie.
She was held for days, tied up, sexually assaulted, given all kinds of alcohol and drugs.
And after 3 days, Paul strangled her. But instead of dismembering her, the couple dumped Kristen's body on the side of the road. Investigators were shocked by Carla's confessions, but they wanted to know, aside from her word, how did they know she was telling the truth? That's when Carla dropped a bombshell. She told them they would find plenty of proof of the couple's depravity inside their home.
Beyond the rapes and the deaths and the tragedy, the next shocking thing were the videotapes.
According to Carla, Paul had videotaped the attacks on both Kristen and Leslie, and the tapes were hidden inside the couple's home. But the videotapes wouldn't be the last shocking confession to come from Carla. Coming up, prosecutors get word that Carla has more secrets.
There's another body.
But it's the victim's identity that leaves them reeling.
The previously ruled accidental death was in fact something far more sinister.
To most observers, beautiful married couple Carla and Paul Bernardo were the image of perfection.
She's very attractive and he was very handsome. And to look at them, you've probably thought this is quite the couple.
However, in January of 1993, Canadian police investigators had just learned that Carla and Paul Bernardo were anything but perfect. Carla had just confessed to police that not only was her husband the infamous Scarborough rapist that had been terrorizing Toronto, but that he was also responsible for the rape, torture, and murder of two teenage girls, Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French.
He goes from being this serial rapist to someone whose fantasies and compulsions go in a different direction. Kidnapping and torture and ultimately the murder of these girls.
Armed with Carla's detailed confession, police wasted no time in arresting Paul Bernardo at the couple's home on February 2nd. Once Paul was in custody, police began searching for the videotapes Carla claimed Paul had made of the sexual assaults on Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French.
They go into the household and they tear their household apart.
But after days of searching, they came up empty-handed.
They're looking for the tapes. They didn't find anything.
They just assumed the videos were destroyed.
Without the videotapes, investigators and prosecutors had nothing against Paul other than his wife's confession. Aware that Carla and her testimony were the key to their case against Paul, prosecutors followed through with the agreement they made with Carla's attorney and offered her a plea deal to turn evidence against her husband.
They said, you will plead guilty to manslaughter. You will receive a total sentence of 10 years, 5 for Kristen and 5 for Leslie, and you will testify against Bernardo.
Carla took the deal. But as Paul's trial date grew closer, prosecutors got word from her attorney that Carla had been carefully reconsidering the terms of her plea agreement.
She's remembering that you have to tell the absolute truth and you have to talk about everything that you've done, every crime that you've been a party to. And you can't hold anything back.
And according to her attorney, Carla had been holding back. There was something else she wanted to get off her chest. Something she hadn't told prosecutors before. Prosecutors made arrangements to have Carla transferred from prison to the police station for another interview, and once there, Carla revealed something no one expected.
She throws this little bomb on them and says, oh, by the way, there's another body.
According to Carla, her husband was responsible for the death of a third victim, and that victim was none other than her little sister, Tammy Homolka.
Up to that point in time, everybody assumed that her death was accidental.
It is the first time that police have an inkling that the previously ruled accidental death of Tammy Homolka was in fact something far more sinister.
In fact, Carla told police that Tammy had been Paul's first murder victim. According to Carla, when Paul moved in with her and her family 3 years earlier, he'd confessed to her that he had a growing attraction to her teenage sister.
Paul Bernardo wanted Tammy Homolka. He desired her sexually.
For Paul, Tammy was a young virgin, and Carla wasn't a virgin, and that irritated him, so he thought, maybe I can have Tammy, and that'll sort of make up for the fact you're not a virgin.
Carla told investigators that at first, Paul's interest in her sister made her uncomfortable, but Paul wouldn't stop talking about Tammy, and soon even began pressuring Carla to help him find a way to become intimate with her sister.
Maybe they would get her drunk, or they would drug her, or somehow involve her in three-way sex. And she wouldn't know what happened.
He made clear to her that he found her sister very attractive. At first it bothered her, and then she decided to see it as perhaps inevitable, and the only way to really hang on to it was to participate and help him fulfill his fantasy, i.e., to rape her sister.
But Carla Carla worried that Paul's plan to knock Tammy out with alcohol wouldn't be enough to keep her sister under for the duration of the assault. So Carla came up with another idea.
To facilitate this, she had brought home drugs from the veterinary clinic where she worked.
Now all the couple had to do was wait for the perfect opportunity. And on the evening of December 23rd, 1990, they saw their chance to put their plan into action.
Just before Christmas, the family had a little family get-together. Drinks were served.
Despite being underage, Tammy partook in the festivities.
She had a few drinks and she got fairly drunk.
Once the rest of the family went to bed, Paul asked the drunken Tammy to join him and Carla in the basement to watch a movie, where he continued to give her more alcohol.
The three of them were in the basement. They plied her with liquor. She became unconscious.
Once Tammy was unconscious, Paul told Carla to administer the anesthetic.
They put halothane on her, which is a drug to knock you out.
When Tammy was knocked out cold from the anesthetic, Paul began his assault. And just like in the rapes of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, Paul made sure to document the entire ordeal.
The sexual activity was videotaped.
But Carla said that in the middle of Paul's assault on Tammy, something unexpected happened.
As she was being assaulted, she started gagging and she eventually choked.
Terrified by Tammy's convulsions, Carla told police that she immediately called 911 while Paul backed away, but it was soon too late. By the time paramedics arrived, Tammy was dead.
The officer who arrived found a drunk teenager who had aspirated stomach contents and thought it was just a tragic accident.
Once again, investigators and prosecutors found themselves shocked by Carla's admission.
There are so many twisted layers to the story, but this is the one I think that is most shocking for people. It's not so much that Paul Bernardo wanted Tammy Homolka, that he desired her sexually, but the fact that he was able to realize that, to obtain his goal of sexual conquest, if you will, with Tammy Homolka, with Carla's approval, with her assistance, with her participation.
Authorities immediately charged Paul Bernardo with a third count of murder. But once again, prosecutors found themselves in a bind. Just like in the cases of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, the videotape of Tammy Homolka's assault was nowhere to be found. And without it, prosecutors knew their only chance to convict Paul of any of the murders was Carla's testimony. Coming up, Carla outlines for the jury how her husband drove her to help commit these terrible crimes.
She's really this terrified woman who's under the thumb of this oppressive, violent sexual predator.
But Paul turns the proceedings on its head by making a shocking claim from the witness stand.
He said, I committed those rapes, but I didn't kill those girls, it was Carla.
Once considered the perfect couple, by the summer of 1995, Carla and Paul Bernardo had become the face of raw evil. Paul had been charged with the rapes of dozens of women, and both he and Carla had been charged with the murders of 3 teenage girls: Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and Carla's own sister, Tammy Homolka. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Carla had accepted a plea deal. For her roles in the crimes, she would serve 12 years in prison, but she would have to testify against her husband.
I think Carla got scared. Really scared. They'd done terrible things. A woman like Carla Homolka knows how to protect herself. The boat was going down. She jumped.
In the summer of 1995, Paul Bernardo's trial began in Toronto. When Carla took the stand, she told the jury she'd had no choice but to watch as her husband brutalized and murdered 3 young women, including her own sister.
She's really this terrified woman who's under the thumb of this oppressive, violent sexual predator.
But Paul's attorneys hoped to prove that Carla wasn't the unwilling participant she claimed to be. And to prove that claim, they presented shocking evidence no one expected.
There were 4, 5, or 6 mini cassettes from a handheld camera.
Paul's attorneys had recovered the missing videotapes of the attacks from a place in the ceiling of the couple's home where Paul had hidden them. But it was clear just from looking at the tape's labels that Paul hadn't been the only one involved in their creation.
The actual physical tape in Carla's handwriting, it says Leslie, Paul, and me. It has hearts and flowers stickers on it.
Due to the graphic nature of the tapes, the judge decided not to play the videos for the courtroom. But the judge did allow audio from the tapes to be played, and even without images, the sounds from the tapes were horrific.
You could hear the girls crying as they're being abused, and those sounds resonated.
The tapes prove the abductions, they prove the unlawful confinements, they prove the sexual assaults.
But that wasn't all the videotapes proved. Just like the handwriting on the tape's label suggested, Paul hadn't committed these crimes alone.
The shock was that Carla Homolka was fully engaged in the sex. She was on the bed, she was naked, she was telling Kristen what to do, here's what he likes.
We all assumed that she was an abused wife. We had nothing else to go on, and then we realized that she was an active participant.
The videos were both disturbing and shocking, and certainly cast doubt on Carla Homolka's testimony, a point the defense planned to exploit when Paul Bernardo took the stand and leveled a jaw-dropping accusation about the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French.
He said, I committed those rapes, but I didn't kill those girls, it was Carla.
Paul Bernardo's defense was that he was a serial rapist. He was a horrible sexual predator, but he wasn't a murderer.
Paul's defense argued that Carla strangled Leslie and Kristen because she was jealous that her husband had found them desirable.
The story is that people started dying because Carla didn't like having the competition.
But it would ultimately be up to the jury whether Paul or Carla was telling the truth. And on September 1st, the jury announced they had reached a verdict.
In the end, he was convicted of first-degree murder.
Paul was convicted on all charges and automatically sentenced to life in prison, Canada's harshest punishment. While most observers felt justice had been served in Paul Bernardo's case, many were also left feeling that it exposed a tremendous injustice when it came to Carla.
They call it the deal with the devil.
When someone participates in the killing of 3 young girls and walks away with a 12-year sentence, that's a farce.
But the debate over Carla's sentence was hardly the only controversy from this shocking and scandalous case that continues to raise questions.
Who would ever imagine that this seemingly perfect Ken and Barbie couple could have such evil minds? She's as evil as he is.
Sexuality.
She was trying to live a conventional life married to a man, but deep inside she was really attracted to women.
Gwen Graham was a troubled 23-year-old looking to make a fresh start.
Gwen had a really horrible past, and she wanted something new.
When Gwen got a job at the nursing home where Kathy was working, the two women had an instant and intense connection.
They had a whirlwind love affair, and things got really heated really quick.
But at the core of this couple's fiery romance was a dark and deadly secret.
They were trying to spell murder with initials in their name, M-U-R-D-E-R.
It was a kind of twisted game.
The two women would soon find themselves in the center of a shocking investigation, one that would leave everyone wondering, had these two caregivers been angels of mercy or angels of death?
When they became a partnership, it was mayhem. There was nothing that was going to stand in her way of being together with this woman forever.
Walker, Michigan, January 18th, 1987. It was just before 8 a.m. at Alpine Manor Nursing Home. A floor nurse entered the room of 60-year-old Alzheimer's patient Marguerite Chambers and found her unconscious and unresponsive. The nurse immediately called emergency medical technicians who attempted to revive Marguerite, but it was too late. From all appearances, it seemed that she had stopped breathing sometime during the night.
She was old, but she was alive and vibrant, and then just out of nowhere, she turns up dead the next day, and that was odd.
Death was a reality everyone at Alpine Manor had to get used to, but Marguerite's passing was unexpected. Marguerite had been healthy and in good spirits when her family visited the day before. They even left her a bouquet of bright red balloons on her nightstand.
For the most part, she seemed pretty content, and her eyes was always traveling.
She was still quite vital and not at all at death's door. And so for her just to up and die all of a sudden was suspect.
But what would make this death even more disturbing was that it would ultimately be the first in a string of mysterious deaths at Alpine Manor.
There were a lot of people that were dying. There were mysterious reasons why they were dying, when they were dying.
It's a nursing home. It's a facility that has a lot of elderly patients. Things are going to happen. It's end of life. But as often and as mysterious as it was, really called a lot of questions.
As the staff of Alpine Manor would come to wrestle with those questions, as well as grieve over Marguerite's passing, no one would notice that one of Marguerite's red balloons was missing. Someone from the nursing home had taken it as a souvenir. Comstock Park, Michigan. With its quiet neighborhoods and conservative Christian values, this suburb of Grand Rapids is a comfortable place to raise a family. But for Catherine May Wood, growing up outside Grand Rapids had been anything but ideal. Kathy's father was an alcoholic who was emotionally distant. Her mother was domineering, extremely conservative, and seemed to have more love for her pets than for her daughter.
She was a young girl who never really got love and never got attention.
Kathy was much larger than most girls her age and grew up self-conscious of her size.
Kathy always portrayed herself as being an outcast or an outsider because of her size.
Her first romantic relationship was with a much shorter and more slender teenager named David. Unlike the other boys, David didn't make fun of Kathy for her size.
With David, she finally had someone that loved her, desired her, cared about her, and made her feel special, pretty much for the first time in her life, where her family just wasn't there for her.
Kathy and David dated for over 6 months, until one day when Kathy's mother discovered that her daughter had been hiding an enormous and scandalous secret.
Kathy's mother went over to pick her up at David's house and asked for David. The mother said, "There's no David here. There's only a Debbie."
It turned out Kathy's boyfriend wasn't a boy after all.
Kathy was keeping a secret from her mother that she was actually really dating another girl.
Kathy hadn't really thought of herself as gay. She just had someone that finally loved her and cared for her, but couldn't share with her family that it was a Debbie, so it had to be David. She came up with the name David to hide the true nature of the relationship from her family.
Kathy's conservative mother was mortified her daughter had been in a same-sex relationship and told her that if she ever saw Debbie again, she put Kathy in a mental institution.
First heartbreak can be really rough, and I'm sure for Kathy it was even more so. And to have his love ripped away by her family was very intense. I can't imagine how that would have affected her and her relationships for the rest of her life.
It would be years before Kathy worked up the courage to open herself up to someone else. Then, in 1979, when she was 17, Kathy met a line worker for a local auto plant named Ken Wood.
When he first met her, he found himself attracted to her because she was smart and she had a kind of a charismatic personality.
Ken really pursued Kathy, and I'm sure it felt great to have someone that interested in her and pursuing her that intensely. Be it man or woman, she had love again.
Kathy and Ken's relationship developed quickly. The couple began dating, and just a few months later, they were hit with some unexpected news.
Kathy found out she was pregnant when she was just 17.
Ken responded to the news by proposing to the then 17-year-old. Kathy said yes, and the couple married the next year. And not long after, Kathy gave birth to their child, a little girl.
For the first time in her life, things were really okay. She had a husband, she had a child, a family. They were sweethearts and things were going great.
But Kathy's happiness would be short-lived. Ken turned out to be a drinker like her father, and it wasn't long before Kathy found herself lonely and depressed again.
Kathy's life with Ken and the new baby isn't the fairy tale romance that she would have wanted it to be.
She felt hemmed in, stayed in the house most of the time with a child. Felt like there was nothing for her to do.
Desperate for an escape from her miserable home life, Kathy decided to take a part-time job in the summer of 1985. She soon found an opening as a nurse's assistant at nearby Alpine Manor nursing home. Kathy enjoyed her work and got along with all the nurses. But Kathy soon discovered something shocking about her coworkers. A good number of her fellow nurses were sleeping together.
There happened to be quite a few lesbians who work there. They have relationships between one another, and they're very uninhibited about being gay.
Her mother's repudiation of her same-sex relationship with Debbie had made Kathy ashamed of her own experience with homosexuality. But Kathy found herself mesmerized by her openly gay coworkers. Instead of going home after work, Kathy started going out with her new coworkers to a local gay and lesbian bar.
She had been isolated with Ken as a mother, and now suddenly she had these whole group of people, so she was like a duck to water.
Ken didn't like Kathy staying out late drinking and partying with her new friends, but Kathy didn't care. She was happier than she'd ever been in her life.
When she went to work with this group of nurses, it was like the blinders were lifted off, and she looked around and saw people that were just like her and wanted exactly what she wanted. I think at this point, Kathy knew that she was gay.
But it was one nurse's assistant in particular that would change Kathy's life forever. A pretty young woman named Gwen Graham. Gwendolyn Graham was only 23 when she came to work at Alpine Manor, but she'd already been through a lot. Like Kathy, Gwen had a rough childhood. She grew up on a small farm in Texas and was raised by an abusive father.
The best way to describe Gwen Graham's upbringing is this lack of emotional nurturing.
And when she was just a little girl, her father hardened her to the harsh realities of life.
He seemed to be fond of introducing Gwen at a young age to the matters of life and death, slaughtering chickens, slaughtering pigs.
Gwen was forced to watch the slaughter against her will, but if she protested or disobeyed, her punishment was always swift and severe.
Her father would literally take her and place her head into a toilet and flush it several times for punishment.
When she was a teenager, Gwen began burning herself with lit cigarettes as a coping mechanism for her father's abuse.
Her arms had scars up and down them.
Gwen moved away from home as soon as she could at 18, and in search for companionship and acceptance, she began a series of relationships with other women.
She knew that she was gay from a very young age, and she was very accepting of it. She just knew that that was her nature.
In 1986, Gwen's girlfriend got a job in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Since there was nothing for Gwen in Texas, she decided to go with her and look for work. When Gwen came across an ad for nurses' assistants at Alpine Manor, she jumped at the opportunity to make a fresh start.
Gwen always wanted to be a paramedic. She had a need to help people. She liked working with people that were in crisis.
As a gay woman, Gwen fit right in with the rest of the staff at Alpine Manor. And her years spent working on the farm had made her a strong and capable worker. But Gwen hadn't been prepared for the loss of a patient. Shortly after she started working at Alpine Manor, she experienced her first death. Gwen sat by the bedside of a terminally ill woman until she passed away. Kathy Wood noticed how upset Gwen was and consoled her.
She was in the bathroom crying at the loss of this patient. And Kathy had come into the bathroom and saw her crying.
The two quickly became friends, bonding over their difficult childhoods during late-night shifts at the nursing home. Gwen was captivated by Kathy's quick mind, and Kathy was drawn to Gwen's toughness. Although Kathy was married and Gwen had a girlfriend, their attraction was undeniable, and one night after work, the two women finally gave in to temptation.
What initially started as a friendship between the two of them eventually blossomed into a love affair.
Gwen and Kathy continued their affair in secret.
They were dating for about 3 months when Kathy realized she was willing to give up everything for Gwen. That was it.
She thought she fell in love with Ken, but after meeting Gwen Graham, she felt that true love.
Kathy asked Ken for a divorce, and she gave him full custody of their 6-year-old daughter so she could focus all her time and attention on Gwen. Gwen, in turn, left her girlfriend, and she and Kathy got an apartment together.
Kathy seemingly had gotten everything she always desired. She got a divorce from Ken. He was taking care of her daughter. She didn't even have those kind of obligations.
Once they were living under the same roof, Gwen introduced Kathy to a new world of sexual fetishes, including bondage and domination.
Kathy hadn't really tried this sort of thing before, but she was very eager to please her lover and willing to try pretty much anything.
By the winter of 1987, Kathy and Gwen's love had never been stronger. But the nursing home where they both worked was going through some tough times. Alpine Manor had inexplicably begun experiencing an unusually higher number of patient deaths than normal.
It's a nursing home, and people are expected to pass away. But these people were dying, and they were dying fast, and no one could explain why.
Like all the nurses at Alpine Manor, Gwen and Kathy worked overtime during this strange period, taking extra shifts and pulling long hours on the ward together. Their budding romance had become overshadowed by a pall of mystery and death, and Kathy began to worry that all the extra time they were putting in at work might stifle their still developing relationship. Gwen told Kathy not to worry. She loved Kathy, and the two women belonged together forever. But no one could have ever imagined the lengths to which these two lovers would go to prove it. Coming up, a man walks into the Grand Rapids Police Department with a shocking story to tell.
He told police that he had a dark secret that he had been keeping for 14 months.
And the story the man tells puts Kathy and Gwen's romance in the crosshairs of a police investigation.
Kathy said, we did things that I'm very ashamed of. And Ken said, what kind of thing? She said, what's the worst thing that you can think of?
Kathy Wood and Gwen Graham met working at the same nursing home. The two women developed a deep bond, and before long, their relationship grew from friendship into something more passionate, visceral, and intense.
Kathy, her first real sexual experience was with a woman. Gwen showed up in her life, and things got really heated really quick. So it's no surprise that they had a whirlwind love affair.
By the fall of 1986, The women's love affair had grown into an obsession. Both realized they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together, so Gwen left her girlfriend, and Kathy filed for divorce from her husband, Ken. But a disturbing series of events was about to unfold that would change the dynamic of Kathy and Gwen's relationship. It started on October 8th, 1988, when a man walked into the local police precinct and said he wanted to report a series of heinous crimes.
That man was Kathy's ex-husband, Ken Wood. He told police that he had a dark secret that he had been keeping for 14 months.
Ken told police that he had been angry that Kathy left him for another woman. But Ken told police that about 10 months after Kathy had left him, she unexpectedly showed back up one night at his door, crying hysterically. Kathy told Ken that she and Gwen had just had a terrible fight. Kathy had moved out of the couple's apartment, and she wanted to know if Ken would let her spend the night at her old house. Ken said he was reluctant at first, but he knew something else was bothering his ex-wife.
He knew that something else was going on besides just a fight.
That's when Kathy suddenly confessed to Ken that she had a dark secret about something she and Gwen had done at Alpine Manor that she needed to get off her chest.
Kathy said, we did things in that home that I'm very ashamed of. And Ken said, what kind of thing? She said, what's the worst thing that you could think of?
Ken said Kathy told him that between January and April of 1987, she had helped Gwen kill 5 patients at Alpine Manor, smothering them as they slept. Ken said at first he didn't know what to think.
He didn't know whether to believe her. He didn't know whether this was a psychological delusion.
Ken ended up letting Kathy spend the night that evening, and the next day, she went back to Gwen. For the next few weeks, Ken didn't tell anyone else what Kathy had told him.
The fact that Kathy and Gwen had killed people was really eating away at him. Things got worse later when Kathy admitted that there was more to the story. Gwen's patients hadn't been randomly selected. It was a kind of twisted game.
They were trying to spell murder with the initials of their name, M-U-R-D-E-R.
Marguerite Chapers, a sweet old lady, lived a long life, and the only reason why she became a part of this little game was simply because her name started with an M.
It was a shocking story, but detectives found it hard to swallow.
If Ken truly thought that his wife had murdered 5 people, why did he keep silent for so long, and why was he coming forward now?
He waited approximately a year or so before he decided to come forward.
Ken didn't really have an excuse for waiting so long. I guess he was just loyal to Kathy and didn't want to betray her.
But even Ken's desire to protect his ex-wife hadn't been able to overcome the guilt he felt for harboring such a dark and twisted secret. Still, police were skeptical of Ken's story, even as they contacted Alpine Manor to see if there had been any suspicious deaths in the past year. Hospital administration reported there had been many more deaths than usual, but all had been determined to be from natural causes. They were patients who'd simply died in their sleep. But the nursing home's management agreed to let police review their records and lay any suspicions to rest.
The people at the Alpine Manor assisted us in getting the records of Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood, as well as records of the people that had died.
Police soon learned that both Kathy and Gwen were no longer working at Alpine Manor. Gwen had resigned in June of the previous year, and Kathy had just quit in October.
So Kathy makes this confession, and then she and Gwen both quit their job. So it looks a little suspicious.
But before detectives spoke to either Kathy or Gwen, they first wanted to make sure they had something to substantiate Ken's story. Investigators pored over Alpine Manor's patient records, looking for anything that would indicate foul play. As they searched through the names of the patients who died while Kathy and Gwen were on duty, they noticed something odd. The first unexpected death had been Marguerite Chambers in January of 1987, and over the next few months, there had been many more. One was named Wanda Urbanski, another Ruth Van Dyke.
Once cops started to really investigate the evidence, and they discover that the first three victims have initials M, U, and R, about to spell out murder, all of a sudden, Ken's crazy stories become real.
Detectives immediately began looking for both women. Gwen's whereabouts were unknown at the time, but Kathy was found at home and quickly brought down to police headquarters for questioning.
The first time police talked to Kathy, she just kind of laughed it off like it was a big junk that Ken didn't get.
We sat down for several hours, and she denied everything. You know, he's lying. Those things didn't happen.
Kathy told police she'd only told Ken the story as a practical joke, and now he was using it to get back at her. She said he'd never gotten over the fact that she'd left him for another woman.
She indicated through the interview that she just made this up. They were just playing games. It was a joke on Ken Wood.
Detectives decided to put some pressure on Kathy, bluffing that they'd already found evidence of foul play in the hospital records. The gamble immediately paid off. Kathy suddenly changed her tune and confessed that what she'd told her ex-husband hadn't been a joke after all.
The more she talked, the more she started to come out and say, well, yeah, these things did happen, but I wasn't involved in it. It was 1 gram.
Coming up, Kathy Wood tells police a harrowing tale of love gone wrong.
The person which she first thought of as sympathetic was turning into a monster.
But as their investigation continues, detectives begin to suspect Kathy still isn't telling them everything.
When you talk to Kathy Wood, it's like you're talking to a shadow.
In the fall of 1986, Kathy Wood and Gwen Graham had fallen madly in love with one another. Both women had left their significant others to be together, and each believed they'd found their soulmate. But their budding romance had been darkened by a string of unexplained deaths among the elderly patients at the nursing home where they both worked.
There were people that were dying. There were mysterious reasons why they were dying, when they were dying.
At the time, the deaths were all assumed to be the result of natural causes, but 14 months later, Grand Rapids detectives were just discovering that there may have been foul play involved.
There was a person indicating that his ex-wife, who worked at a nursing home, had told him that she was involved with killing approximately 5 or 6 people at the nursing home.
Kathy's ex-husband, Ken Wood, had come to police and told them that he believed his ex-wife and her partner, Gwen Graham, were behind the deaths, and that the women had specifically chosen their victims as part of a macabre game.
They were trying to spell murder with initials of their name, M-U-R-D-E-R.
Police immediately tracked Kathy down and confronted her with her ex-husband's claims. And after some pressure, Kathy had admitted that everything Ken had accused her of was true. She and Gwen had killed 5 patients at Alpine Manor.
Did any of you girls there at the Alpine, did they ever participate?
No.
It was just you and Gwen.
But while Kathy admitted to taking part in the murders, she insisted she'd been an unwilling participant. According to Kathy, the events leading up to the crimes began not long after she and Gwen moved in together. One night, when they were both working a late shift, Kathy said she went looking for Gwen to take their meal break, but when she opened the door to Marguerite Chambers' room, she made a shocking discovery. Gwen was standing over the bed, smothering the Alzheimer's patient with a washcloth.
I went in the room. She was on the far side of the bed. She told Marguerite was making noises.
She held it up to her nose. Plugged off her airway until she didn't move anymore.
Kathy said she was horrified, but Gwen told her it was an act of mercy. Marguerite had been suffering from Alzheimer's for years, and Gwen said she was doing her a favor. But Kathy also said she could tell that Gwen seemed to get perverse pleasure from killing Marguerite, and even took one of the red balloons Marguerite's family had left her as a trophy. When the two women got home later that night, Gwen was so turned on that she tied Kathy to the bed and made love to her. Kathy said that after they had sex, Gwen informed her that Marguerite wouldn't be the last patient they euthanized. Next time, Gwen said that she and Kathy were going to do it together as proof of their love.
They would have a secret that they each held, and that if anybody left the relationship, the other person could put them in prison for the rest of their lives.
I have something on you, you have something on me, therefore we're going to be together forever.
Kathy told detectives that she was frightened of what might happen if she refused. She was especially afraid that she might lose Gwen if she didn't follow along, so Kathy agreed to the lovers' pact.
Kathy didn't want to lose Gwen Graham as a lover or as a friend. Kathy believed if Gwen Graham was with her and did this, she knew that Gwen would never leave her.
Kathy said that over the next few months, she and Gwen killed 5 patients. Gwen would cover their tracks by making it look like their victims had died in their sleep.
Gwen would roll up a washcloth and hold it over the mouth and the nose of a patient and smother them to death. So there was no physical evidence.
She would go into the room and smother these people while Kathy stood watch so that nobody would interfere with the murder.
And each time the couple killed a patient, Gwen took something to remember them by. After suffocating 97-year-old Edith, Gwen took a bracelet from her wrist. From 79-year-old May Basin, Gwen took a tiny dollhouse. Kathy told investigators killing became like an aphrodisiac to Gwen.
After each murder, Gwendolyn Graham was really relaxed, and they would go to a different secluded area in Alpine Manor or at home later and have sex because it was exciting for them.
But Kathy said she realized it was only a matter of time before the two lovers would be caught.
And at one point, she intercepted a registered nurse coming down the aisleway and stalled the nurse while Gwendolyn Graham completed her task.
It had been a close call, so close that Kathy told Gwen they needed to stop. Little did Kathy then know that just 2 weeks later, the couple's murderous game would come to an end, but not in the way Kathy had ever expected. Since the day they first started dating, Kathy was afraid Gwen would eventually find someone prettier than her. And in the summer of 1987, her fears finally came true in the form of a cute new nurse's assistant named Heather Berriger.
Entering into this picture of this dysfunctional, codependent relationship between Kathy Wood and Gwen Graham is a young nurse's aide.
Kathy told detectives when Heather showed up on the ward, everyone took notice, especially Gwen. Like most of the other nurses at Alpine Manor, Heather was a big flirt. She also seemed open to same-sex relationships, and she and Gwen had an instant connection.
She was a former cheerleader, very attractive, blonde, pretty, and she and Gwen began to develop some chemistry together.
Kathy said as soon as Gwen met Heather, it was clear Gwen began to lose interest in their relationship. Before long, Gwen and Heather started having an affair. Kathy said it broke her heart to lose Gwen to another woman, but she claimed she did take some solace in knowing that their breakup meant that the murders at Alpine Manor would finally come to an end. To detectives, Kathy's confession was a horrifying tale of caregiver abuse. But before any arrests could be made, they needed more than just the word of a spurned lover. Detectives asked Kathy to submit to a polygraph, and once again, she surprised them by agreeing to it. But after hours of detailed questions, The results came back inconclusive.
It's quite common. If you can't find somebody deceptive, a lot of times they'll rule it inconclusive.
The test administrator couldn't tell investigators whether Kathy was lying about the murders or not. But authorities were certain from the test results that she definitely wasn't telling them everything. And to investigators, that could mean only one thing.
She was hiding something, and the reason why she probably flunked the polygraph is because she was more of an active participant.
Coming up, detectives finally get Gwen Graham's side of the story.
The dominant person in the relationship was actually Kathy Wood, and Gwen Graham was more of her protector.
And later, both women are put on trial, and the accusations put forth by Gwen's defense team will have everyone questioning just which parts of Kathy Wood's confession were true.
The whole theory is that this was nothing more than Kathy Wood's mind games, that there was no homicides.
In the winter of 1987, 5 patients in Grand Rapids Alpine Manor Nursing Home died under mysterious circumstances. The patients' families believed their loved ones had passed away from natural causes, but investigators now believe they had been murdered by a pair of love-struck and deranged nurses named Kathy Wood and Gwen Graham.
These were not mercy killings. They were part of a lesbian love bond.
They wanted just to kill people for the sake of a pact between both of them, so neither one of them would leave each other.
But the couple's deadly lovers' pact had been broken when Gwen unexpectedly dumped Kathy, leaving her for a prettier and younger nurse's aide named Heather Berriger. Gwen and Heather had quit working at Alpine Manor not long after their affair began, and the 2 women had moved to Texas that fall.
She took Heather Berger back to Tyler, Texas, where she's originally from.
When questioned by police, Kathy had confessed to her role in the crimes and even submitted to a polygraph test, but the results had been inconclusive. And with no other evidence to go on, investigators decided it was time to get Gwen Graham's side of the story. Detectives flew to Tyler, Texas, and discovered Gwen was now working in the children's ward of a local hospital. Officers met Gwen at her work and brought her downtown for questioning. Gwen denied any involvement in a patient's death while she was at Alpine Manor, and claimed Kathy's story was nothing more than a fabrication from a jealous and vindictive woman.
She keeps saying that it was all Kathy Wood making this all up to get back at her for taking Heather down to Texas with her.
Gwen also characterized her relationship with Kathy much differently from how Kathy described it. Gwen said she and Kathy had enjoyed a love affair that lasted about a year, but Gwen insisted the relationship was mostly physical and never very serious. But even still, Gwen said that Kathy was extremely jealous and possessive.
She was convinced that Gwen would leave her, and Kathy was extremely jealous of anybody that Gwen paid attention to.
Gwen had put up with Kathy's behavior for a while, but she said eventually it was too much to take.
Gwen was getting very tired of what she called Kathy's mind games, this consistent jealousy.
According to Gwen, it all came to an explosive end when Kathy caught Gwen with Heather Berriger. To Kathy, it was the ultimate betrayal. But Gwen thought her relationship with Kathy had run its course, and she was just moving on to her next casual fling. Gwen said they got into a huge fight that night over Heather, and Gwen moved out. She said Kathy chased her out of the house, screaming that she'd make Gwen pay for leaving her.
If I can't have you, nobody's gonna have you.
Even though they'd broken up more than 6 months earlier, Gwen believed Kathy had never forgiven her, and was now trying to make up the accusations as a way of punishing her. In an effort to prove her story, Gwen consented to a polygraph. But like Kathy, the results from her test were inconclusive. Police had no choice but to let Gwen go. As things stood, it was her word against Kathy's. But detectives had one more trick up their sleeves. During Kathy's initial interview, she'd been evasive, choosing her words carefully to make it seem like she had been an innocent bystander.
She's a very believable storyteller because she has lots of details, and she exudes a personality that's somewhat that of a victim, someone that you would feel sorry for.
When you talk to Kathy Wood, it's like you're talking to a shadow.
Investigators believed Kathy had been holding out on them, so they asked her to submit a second polygraph. But this time, they weren't taking any chances. They brought in a 12-year veteran who'd conducted over 1,000 exams in his career. After almost 3 hours of questioning, Kathy finally confessed. She hadn't simply been an innocent bystander after all. Kathy told investigators that she and Gwen had been lying in bed together one night when they came up with the idea for the murders.
There is a poem that Kathy wrote to Gwen, and when they first got together, they said, "I will love you forever."
Kathy said that for each patient they killed together, they would renew their pledge and add a day.
And then when they murdered a patient, it was, "I will love you forever and a day." And then they murdered another patient, "I will love you forever in 2 days." And finally, when the poem was finished, it was, "I will love you forever in 5 days.
Based on her confession, Kathy Wood was arrested for the murders of Marguerite Chambers and Edith Cook. But when police went back to Tyler, Texas to arrest Gwen Graham, they discovered she was missing.
We had gone to the trailer park, and the owner said they moved out.
It looked like Gwen and Heather had seen the writing on the wall and decided to go on the run. Coming up, as the hunt for the missing lovers begins, police catch a lucky break.
She turned her head, and she saw me, and she looked like she saw a ghost.
And the killer finally stands trial for murder. But will a lack of evidence set her free?
The defense was that there were no murders and that this was just Kathy playing mind games and being a jealous former lover.
In the fall of 1987, Kathy Wood and Gwen Graham fell in love while working as caretakers in a Michigan nursing home. The couple swore they would stay together forever, and 14 months later, homicide detectives discovered the nurses had sealed their pact with a string of murders, smothering 5 elderly patients in their sleep.
They would have a secret that they each held, and that if anybody left the relationship, the other person could put them in prison for the rest of their lives.
After initially claiming she had been an innocent bystander, Kathy Wood finally confessed to her role in planning the murders and was arrested. But when officers traveled to Tyler, Texas to arrest Gwen Graham, they discovered she had disappeared with her new lover, Heather Berriger. Texas state troopers immediately put out an APB for Gwen and Heather. But officers wouldn't have to look very far to find the women. No sooner had the alert gone over the wire than one of the case's detectives just happened to spot Gwen and Heather at a stoplight in downtown Tyler.
I walked up to Gwen Graham's vehicle, and she turned her head, and she saw me, and she looked like she saw a ghost.
Investigators immediately placed Gwen under arrest, charging her with 5 counts of murder.
Heather Berriger was screaming, thrashing around in the car, saying that we got the wrong person.
Back in Grand Rapids, Kathy Wood was cutting a deal with prosecutors. Although she confessed to planning the murders, the lack of physical evidence meant that authorities would need to depend almost entirely on her testimony to convict Gwen Graham.
Everything comes from Kathy Wood. She's the source of just about 99.9% of everything that happened. We sat down with Kathy Wood, with the Kent County prosecutor, and she agreed to the plea agreement.
In exchange for her testimony, Kathy was allowed to plead guilty to 1 count of conspiracy and 1 count of second-degree murder for the death of Marguerite Chambers. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison on each count. On September 9th, 1989, Gwen Graham stood trial for the murders of 5 patients at Alpine Manor Nursing Home. Gwen pled not guilty, and her defense centered on the fact that no evidence had been found to indicate the patients had died of anything but natural causes.
The defense was that there were no murders and that this was just Kathy playing mind games and being a jealous former lover.
But prosecutors painted a very different picture. Using Kathy Wood's testimony, they portrayed Gwen as a diabolical puppet master who used Kathy's love and devotion to compel her to help kill 5 innocent victims.
She put on an incredible performance before the jury. Tears, the story of David Debbie, how she was never loved, and how she just wanted Gwen's love.
It was a compelling story, but ultimately, Gwen's fate wouldn't be determined by the testimony of Kathy Wood.
It wasn't Kathy's testimony that convinced the jury. It was Heather Berger's.
Heather had initially refused to talk to prosecutors, but in the months leading up to the trial, her conscience had driven her to come forward.
She admitted one day that Gwen had broken down and confessed to her that they had killed 5 people.
For the jury, it was compelling proof that Gwen was lying to them. Despite the lack of physical evidence, they found her guilty on all 5 counts of murder. She received 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Gwendolyn Graham created quite a scene. She was screaming when the deputies were taking her away to the lockup.
With both Kathy and Gwen behind bars, most believed justice in the Alpine Manor murders had finally been served. But many questions from the case still remain, chief among them how an intense and passionate romance between 2 caregivers could give birth to something so vile, horrifying, and evil.
Kathy was so desperate for Gwen's love, there was nothing she wouldn't do, and that included killing innocent victims.
Amanda Smith was a beautiful and wealthy widow who'd found success as an up-and-coming actress.
She was in TV shows, The OC, Sopranos. She felt like her career was starting to take off.
Grant Hayes was a talented musician who'd built a loyal fan following.
Grant had a magnetic personality. People were drawn to him.
When these 2 met on the beaches of St. John, they had an instant and passionate connection. But their heated love affair would be torn apart by a gruesome discovery.
They started to find pieces of human remains.
And the ensuing investigation would shock the nation. Now, Killer Couples brings you this diabolical tale of defeat and betrayal. From Grant and Amanda's exclusive home videos,
I saw a spark in my mom's eye that I hadn't seen in a long time.
to the winding investigation,
The surveillance video shows Grant Hayes looking for Saul.
all the way through the couple's trial, where new evidence was unveiled that was so shocking, divers surfaced daydreaming of her future.
She was the girl that was gonna make it. She was gonna get out of the small town, the working class lifestyle.
Amanda saw her first chance at what she hoped would be a better life at age 16, when she got engaged to a 20-year-old truck driver named Scott Elmer. Even though Amanda was underage at the time, her parents gave her permission to get married, and the couple quickly started a family.
By the time she was 16, she was pregnant with me, and 2 months after her 17th birthday, she had me.
But Amanda's first marriage didn't last. She and her husband fought constantly, and by the time she was 20, Amanda was divorced and struggling to raise her daughter alone. But all that changed when she was introduced by friends to a wealthy entrepreneur by the name of Nikki Smith.
He was a lot more successful than her first husband.
And at 39, Nikki was also more than 14 years older than Amanda. But that didn't matter to her. Nikki and Amanda had a deep and immediate connection. And after marrying him in 1998, Amanda and her daughter were able to live the life of luxury she'd always wanted.
We did not worry about money. We did not worry about groceries. We did not worry about the house payment.
But on Memorial Day of 2000, Amanda's dream lifestyle turned into a nightmare.
Nikki had dove into 6 inches of water on the lake where we lived. He broke his neck, and he was paralyzed from the neck down.
He ended up in the hospital and died shortly after that.
Devastated by Nikki's loss, Amanda became deeply depressed. Though her grief was somewhat eased by the sizable inheritance Nikki left her.
When Nikki Smith died, Amanda inherited a pretty good chunk of change, and she was set financially. She didn't have worries that most people would at her age.
Amanda decided to take advantage of her financial independence by moving to New York City, where she decided to try her hand as an actress, a move she hoped would help take her mind off Nikki's death.
She was able to get some small parts in TV shows, The OC, Sopranos, so she felt like her career was starting to take off.
Amanda stayed busy with small roles in films and TV shows for the next 6 years. Then, in 2007, Amanda and her daughter decided they needed a short break from the Big Apple. So they moved from bustling New York City to St. John in the Virgin Islands.
It's paradise. There are beaches that have white sand like paper, and the ocean is so clear and blue that you can see 60 feet down. There is an energy that is unexplainable there.
The energy in St. John might have been amazing, but acting gigs on the island were hard to come by. And not even St. John's white sand and crystal blue water could keep Amanda from feeling lonely and depressed again. She longed for someone special to share her life with. Luckily, she seemed to find that person just a few months after moving to St. John, when she caught the eye of a handsome musician named Grant Hayes.
They were both very attracted to one another physically, and so it was kind of like they had an instant connection.
Born in 1979, Grant grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, and knew from the start exactly what he wanted to do with his life.
Grant Hayes had big dreams. Grant Hayes wanted to be famous. He wanted to be a musician.
Determined to make it as a professional musician, he started playing guitar in the Raleigh nightclub scene. And within just a few short years, Grant had earned a reputation as one of the best singer-songwriters in the city.
He was somebody that would play at local nightclubs, people would go to see him, and he had a lot of fans. He had quite a following.
A following which included plenty of ladies. One of those women had been a beautiful 22-year-old brunette named Laura Ackerson. Grant had been immediately drawn to Laura when he saw her at his shows.
She was fascinated by him. She was intrigued and didn't really know how to take him, but she knew she wanted to be with him.
Grant and Laura began dating, and within just a few years, the couple had 2 children together. With a family to support, Grant began to feel even more pressure to be a breadwinner, which wasn't always easy as a singer-songwriter.
He would go to one of his gigs and sit there and play music all night and end up coming home with no money. He wasn't able to support her. She was unemployed too.
Grant needed a new audience to revitalize his fledgling career, and he told Laura he knew just the place where his particular style of music would be a hit.
Grant's style was more of this folk reggae music that really fit with the Virgin Islands. He thought that his music would be popular there.
In 2009, Grant moved his family to St. John. Once on the island, Grant quickly developed a devoted following. But despite his success, Grant's relationship with Laura took a turn for the worse.
He's working nights, probably sleeping during the day. So what he did probably made it difficult.
The relationship wasn't working out. She wasn't happy there. She ends up going back to North Carolina with the kids.
Even though his relationship with Laura was over, Grant was upset she took the kids with her back to North Carolina. But with gigs lined up and money coming in, he decided to stay behind. And it was while Grant was playing one of his regular gigs at one of the island's most popular bars that he took notice of the beautiful blonde watching and listening to him from the bar, 37-year-old Amanda Smith.
Amanda first saw Grant in the Virgin Islands, and she became infatuated with him. She wanted to see him play because she enjoyed him.
After his set, Grant walked over and introduced himself to her. It was clear the couple had instant chemistry.
They both had these big personalities in a way, and a lot of charisma and a lot of creativity, and so it was kind of like kismet.
In fact, for the first time since her late husband's death, Amanda found herself interested in another man, and she coyly suggested a way for her and Grant to better get to know each other.
Amanda asked Grant to teach her how to play the guitar.
Grant eagerly agreed, but as soon as the pair began spending time alone, the music lessons were quickly forgotten.
There was definitely some sort of romantic relationship going on. It was no longer just guitar lessons.
But there was more to Grant and Amanda's relationship than just sex. Amanda was deeply attracted to Grant's artistic side, while Grant was equally bewitched by Amanda's beauty and sultry personality. And it wasn't long before the couple began planning their futures together.
They just immediately came together and kind of meshed right away and decided that they wanted to be together permanently.
Grant was also adamant that no matter what his future with Amanda held, his two sons would be part of it. Though with the boys living in North Carolina with his ex, Laura Ackerson, that dream seemed unlikely. But in early 2010, Grant told Amanda he was ready to make a bold move.
Grant decided, you know what? I think that the best thing to do is to fight for custody of both of my kids.
Which meant that he and Amanda would have to leave St. John and go back to North Carolina.
Grant basically said, I need to go back there because I need to be with my children, and this is the only way to make that happen.
Once the couple was stateside, they decided to make it official. In April of 2010, Amanda and Grant flew to Las Vegas and were married.
The ceremony was touching. You know, I saw a spark in my mom's eye that I hadn't seen in a long time.
And after almost a year of battling his ex, Laura Ackerson, in the courts, Amanda and Grant learned that their dream of being a family was going to come true. In May of 2011, a judge granted Amanda and Grant primary custody of the two boys.
He was making some money and was able to provide for them, and Laura was struggling financially. She was having trouble, getting employed, staying employed, providing. She just didn't have her life together.
Grant and Amanda were overjoyed with the judge's decision, and just a few weeks later, were blessed with even more good news. Amanda was pregnant. On June 9th, she gave birth to a daughter. She and Grant couldn't have been happier. But where Laura had gone after she left the apartment with a $25,000 check in hand, Grant told investigators he had no idea.
Grant said maybe she had just taken money and taken off.
Investigators thanked Grant for the information. They sent out an APB for Laura, hoping to track her down if she had indeed left town. But just as detectives started exploring that theory, patrol officers found Laura's car in a Raleigh parking lot. Her purse was still sitting in the passenger seat.
It's a white Ford Focus. It turns up in an apartment complex north of downtown Raleigh.
The fact that Laura's purse was still in her car most likely meant she hadn't left her vehicle with the idea of being gone for very long. But it was the address of the apartment complex where the vehicle was that investigators found most interesting.
They find that car in an apartment complex, which happens to be right next door to the apartment complex where Amanda and Grant Hayes live.
The discovery immediately made police question everything Grant Hayes had told them on the phone. Had Laura really come over to his apartment the evening she disappeared? Had she willingly given up custody of her children? Or was it all lies to cover up something Grant Hayes was hiding?
It raises questions. I mean, what's really going on here? Where is Laura Ackerson?
Coming up, investigators uncover even more troubling information that conflicts with Grant's story.
There was a custody hearing coming up.
And detectives finally land their first big break.
Laura kept very, very detailed diaries, and she really started to fear for her safety when it came to Grant.
For newlyweds Amanda and Grant Hayes, life seemed to be going great. Just 6 months after they tied the knot, Amanda gave birth to the couple's daughter, and they'd just been awarded primary custody of Grant's 2 young sons from a previous relationship. But their newfound happiness had been jolted in July of 2011, when police learned that the mother of Grant's 2 young sons, 27-year-old Laura Ackerson, had mysteriously disappeared.
A friend reported her missing.
Grant told investigators that he'd seen Laura on the day she'd gone missing. According to Grant, she'd shown up on his doorstep to drop off their kids, and he'd paid her a large sum of money before she left his apartment.
Laura would not pursue custody any further in exchange for a payment of $25,000.
Grant told investigators that he assumed Laura had headed out of town with the money. But detectives were now questioning Grant's theory that Laura had simply left town on her own volition. 7 days after she went missing, police found Laura's white Ford Focus in the parking lot next to the apartment complex where Grant and his new wife Amanda lived. But when detectives searched the vehicle, they found no trace of the missing mother's whereabouts.
They looked for any signs of struggle.
They found no sign of any foul play.
Desperate for any clue as to where Laura might be, detectives decided to circle back to Laura's family and friends. One of the people they spoke to was Laura's close and longtime friend, Heidi Schumacher. When asked if she had any idea of someone who might want to harm Laura, Heidi dropped a bombshell. Apparently, Laura had been afraid of someone.
She had told me 2 months before then, if anything happened to her, if she went missing, if she committed suicide, if she got into a car accident, know that Grant did it.
According to Heidi, Laura's history with Grant had not only been troubled, but abusive.
He was just being arrogant.
Which is why when the judge had awarded Grant primary custody of their children, Laura had told Heidi she was determined to get them back.
Laura was very concerned about the children's welfare when they were in Grant's custody.
To fear her ex.
She really started to fear for her safety when it came to Grant.
In searching Laura's apartment, investigators also found a report from the court-appointed custody evaluator, and its findings were telling. Not only had the evaluator found that Laura was fit to have primary custody of her 2 sons, but also plenty of reasons why Grant should not.
He had some substance abuse issues and possibly some mental health issues.
The report also pointed out that after months of trying, Laura had finally just landed a new job and was now making a steady income, while Grant and Amanda Hayes were nearly broke. Apparently, Grant's music career had floundered ever since he and Amanda returned to North Carolina, and he and Amanda had completely drained her inheritance from her late husband, Nicky Smith.
He had no money coming in at all. My mom was now broke, had gone through $175,000 in less than a year.
The discovery that Grant and Amanda Hayes were broke raised a major major red flag for investigators. If they didn't have any money, it seemed to spend $25,000 as he'd claimed.
There was no $25,000. There was no money at all.
Eager to get to the bottom of what was really going on, detectives swung back by Grant's apartment. But Grant and Amanda still weren't home. And this time, when investigators tried to call Grant on his cell phone, he didn't answer. Police couldn't help but wonder, had the musician realized cops were on his trail and gone on the run with his family? Detectives subpoenaed Grant's cell phone records, hoping they might give some clue as to where Grant, Amanda, and their children might be.
Investigators had a way of tracking a cell phone based on the signal that it put out.
And when detectives looked at the signals put off by Grant's phone, they were shocked to see that the last signal hadn't been emitted anywhere near Raleigh, but instead over 1,000 miles away in Texas. Detectives jumped on the new lead.
They just got in the car and they drove to Texas where that cell phone was pinging.
2 detectives drive 24 hours through the night to show up in Fort Bend County.
The location of the phone's last signal was traced to a home in Richmond, Texas.
They realized that that location where that cell phone is pinging from is Amanda Hayes' sister's house.
Detectives couldn't help but wonder, were Grant and Amanda hiding out at her sister's house? And did this mean Amanda could also be involved in Laura's disappearance as well? When they knocked on the door, Amanda's sister Karen Barry answered and told them that neither Grant nor Amanda were there, but she did admit that the couple had recently visited her home.
Amanda and Grant have been there and just left.
According to Karen, Grant and Amanda had just shown up unannounced at her house last week.
Grant and Amanda arrived in Texas pulling a U-Haul trailer. And in that trailer, they had a dresser. Give this piece of furniture to Karen.
Karen claimed detectives had just missed Grant and Amanda. They'd left that morning and were now on their way back to North Carolina.
They now realized that Grant was at Karen's house in Texas a couple days earlier when they had talked with him about Laura's disappearance.
But when Grant was on the phone with investigators, why hadn't he told them he was visiting his sister-in-law's house? And what had been his real reason for visiting Texas? The answers to those questions would turn the entire case on its head. Coming up, investigators pry Amanda's sister Karen for more information.
Karen begins to cry and asks to pray.
And what they learn casts the spotlight of suspicion not only on Grant, but Amanda as well.
They look through the pictures and voila! Who do they see? Amanda Hayes dumping the acid.
The summer of 2011 had started as a joyous and blissful time for newlyweds Amanda and Grant Hayes. Laura Ackerson went missing. Investigators found themselves not only on an urgent search for Laura, but wondering if Grant and Amanda had anything to do with her disappearance.
After piecing on the problems between Laura and Grant, they believe he may be responsible for her disappearance.
Adding to their concern was the fact that Grant and Amanda had made an unexplained trip to the home of Amanda's sister, Karen Barry, in Richmond, Texas. But by the time investigators arrived, Grant and Amanda had already left. And when detectives pressed Amanda's sister, Karen, for more details about Grant and Amanda's visit, she suddenly became visibly shaken.
Karen begins to cry and asks to pray.
Karen told them that Amanda and Grant arrived at her home on July 18th under the guise of delivering a family heirloom. But as they unloaded the dresser from the back of a trailer they'd brought with them, Karen noticed something odd.
Behind the dresser, they had several coolers.
Karen claimed there were about 6 coolers in total stacked in the back. And while the coolers seemed strange, even more concerning were the bizarre questions Grant and Amanda began asking.
They asked about whether there were alligators in the water and whether the alligators would eat things, like, for example, a person.
But that wasn't all. On the second day of their visit, the couple unexpectedly set out to go fishing in a nearby creek in the middle of the night.
Grant and Amanda took a little fishing boat out. Seemed a little suspicious to her.
It seemed suspicious to investigators as well, so they set their sights on finding out exactly what Amanda and Grant had been doing at the creek.
They immediately ordered a dive team from Houston to come in and search the water.
And not long after the divers entered the creek's murky waters, their worst fears were confirmed.
They started to pull these human remains up right away.
It didn't take long for investigators to confirm that the remains, in fact, did belong to Laura Ackerson.
They did retrieve dental records, and that's how they identified the body parts as being Laura Ackerson's.
It was also clear that dismemberment hadn't been the only atrocity performed on Laura's body in an attempt to conceal her identity.
It appeared someone had poured acid on these remains to maybe even try to dissolve them.
And not far from the location where Laura's remains had been found, police officers made a telling discovery.
They actually find some containers of acid not far from Karen Berry's house, kind of dumped at the end of a dirt road.
A dirt road that just happened to be outfitted with surveillance cameras. And when investigators checked the footage on the dirt road surveillance cameras, they made a shocking find.
They looked through the pictures and voila! Who do they see? Amanda Hayes dumping the acid.
Between the surveillance footage and the testimony from Amanda's sister Karen, investigators were able to secure arrest warrants for Grant and Amanda Hayes. On July 25th, they were taken into custody at the home of Grant's parents.
We arrest the defendants and charge them with the first-degree murder of Laura Ackerson.
Following their arrests, detectives and prosecutors were eager to question Grant and Amanda about Laura's murder, but the couple wasn't willing to talk. Even without a confession from either Grant or Amanda, prosecutors were confident in their case. And as Grant's trial began in September of 2013, it became clear that he, too, was confident.
I would see him come in and out of the courtroom smiling, laughing with his attorneys. This is a guy that's on trial for murder. And it doesn't seem to bother him.
Prosecutors opened their case by arguing that Grant Hayes was enraged when Laura put his plans for the future with Amanda and his children in jeopardy.
She was fighting him to get the kids. He knew that she was going to fight forever, and he would never get rid of her.
That is, unless he did it himself. Prosecutors argued that after the custody evaluator's plan came out, Grant knew he was going to lose custody of his sons to Laura. So he came up with a plan. A plan he set in motion on July 13th, when he offered Laura an extra evening with the boys if she would pick them up at his apartment.
Grant Hayes had lured Laura Ackerson over to his apartment.
But no sooner had Laura walked into the front door of Grant and Amanda's apartment than prosecutors
Murder.
For her role in Laura's murder, Amanda Hayes was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Today, Grant and Amanda are serving their sentences in separate prison facilities in North Carolina. But even though their incarcerations have effectively put an end to their romance, they haven't put an end to the questions raised by this disturbing case.
Grant and Amanda were the perfect couple. They had everything. They were beautiful. They were talented. They had everything going for them. And how they could do something so evil, we'll never know.
Love makes you do crazy things. Sometimes murder.
gazing at the stars in the velvet sky, lost in memories of a time gone by. Melodies of the past played in my mind, whispers of the wind slowing down time. Let the music surround us, take us away to a sweeter place where memories stay. In this world of dreams, we will find a little piece of soul in the music that binds, painting pictures in the colors of sound. Echoes of the heart softly resound, lost in the rhythm, feeling so free.